So what time you gonna be here? Tyler asked me impatiently, his voice obviously frustrated. 'Cause the storm's gonna hit any second and I want to get dinner cooked now in case the power goes out. I glanced up at the grey sky from underneath my umbrella and saw a large front of ominous-looking clouds steadily drifting this way. No joke, I replied loudly as I shouted over the sound of falling rain and thunder. I'm on the corner of Eldred and Warren now, so I'll be there in 5 minutes. Alright, I'll start the oven now. I flinched at a particularly loud crack of thunder and quickened my pace. What are we eating anyway? I asked to keep my mind occupied and help me ignore the squishing of my soaking wet socks. Guess, Tyler responded, and I could imagine his cocky grin. I sighed knowingly. Pepperoni pizza with black olives and jalapenos? Pepperoni pizza with black olives and jalapenos. Yes, sir, that is correct, Tyler began. It is the ultimate comfort food, as you get a little bit of everything. You get your vegetables and your dairy and your wheat and... Are you here yet? I looked around, confused in the rain. No? Oh, never mind then. I thought I heard the doorbell. I shook my head. You don't have a doorbell. You complained about it yesterday. The rainwater was collecting now, running down the streets and sidewalks in a rapid torrent. I could see the stream break against my boots, carrying dirt and leaves and little twigs with it. I shivered as the wind blew harder and cast misty spray against my face and neck. I slipped and caught myself against the fence post. Hey man, I'll be there in a bit. I'm hanging up before I bust my ass in my new phone. See ya. I hung up and slid my cell into my pocket. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and I blinked away the after images as I trudged along the line of yards where the sidewalk ended. I grimaced as my boots slurped in and out of the mud with sickening wet squelches letting me know I would soon be filthy. I cursed under my breath and silently berated myself for getting talked into this. Should have stayed at home. Walking 3 miles through the rain with a storm on the way just to hang out was a terrible idea. Should have just stayed in bed. My curmudgeonly conversation with myself continued for several minutes until, at long last, sopping wet and freezing, I found myself on the doorstep of TJ's new house. It was old and weathered, with faded paint and windows so scratched they looked foggy. The grass, despite the rain this autumn had brought, was yellow and dead. I walked up the cracked driveway and to the front door. I knocked on it loudly and shivered as I wrapped my arms around myself. No answer. I knocked again, banging my fist against the wooden door so hard, flecks of chipped green paint broke off and flitted to the ground. Tyler, it's me! Open the damn door! The door swung open with a loud creak, and Tyler's face smiled at me from within. Sorry man, couldn't hear you over all the noise. He waved me inside. I kicked off my boots and threw my jacket in the corner to get the wet chill off of me. He looked me over and laughed, his green eyes crinkling at the corners as he guffawed at my current state. So, how'd it go? He asked, sarcastically. I groaned and headed down the hall. Lovely. Now, where's your bathroom? First door on the left. Pizza's almost done at least. He called after me as I padded down the wood floors in jeans heavy with rainwater. The house was bigger than I expected. Sure, it was old and needed a lot of work done, but it was good sized. It had that old 70s style layout with lots of little rooms sectioned off into their own areas. As such, I didn't see much of the place as I walked past closed doors to get to the bathroom. The door at the end of the hall inched open as I approached, then shut a moment later. Guess his roommates aren't the chatty type. Works for me. I toweled off in the bathroom and laid my jeans out to dry, slipping into a pair of sweatpants Tyler had set out on the counter. I flicked the light off and went down the hall toward the kitchen to get some pizza, my stomach growling ravenously. The door at the end of the hall squeaked open behind me, and then the bathroom door closed. I looked over my shoulder and saw the bathroom light on again. "Here's your half," Tyler announced, and set 4 slices of pizza on the table. "TV signal's out due to the weather, but we can still watch a movie." "Sounds good," I mumbled through a mouthful of piping hot pizza, and followed him to the living room. The house was dark, I noted, in every room. The floors were all wood, no carpet, and the walls were painted a deep grey like the thunderclouds overhead. The light seemed dim, despite having new bulbs, and made colour wash away and fade. I shivered. Tyler glanced at me. "Still cold? I got a hoodie you can wear." I nodded and he tossed the red pullover my way. Some comedy I wasn't really paying attention to played on the television. Tyler laughed here and there, sometimes repeating the jokes and pointing. But I felt detached. I set my pizza down, appetite diminished, and flinched as one of the bedroom doors in the house slammed shut. I could hear them moving around in their room, possibly rearranging furniture, and glanced at Tyler to see if he had reacted to the noise. But he hadn't. Having lived only on my own since graduation, I wasn't used to having someone else in the house. My apartment was small, not quite cramped, but certainly on a cozy side. As such, I had everything exactly as I wanted it, and not a single thing out of place. It was quiet and well lit, with thick, cushy carpet and central heating. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, and 0 roommates making such a ruckus. I opened my mouth to voice such concerns, then realized it could come off as snobbish. I bit my lip and kept silent, not wanting to offend my friend by insulting his new house and roommates, whom I never met. "You full already?" Tyler asked me, and I shrugged. "Not really hungry, I guess." "Well, damn." He reached out and snatched up my remaining slices. "I'll take those off your hands." My mouth felt dry and sticky, so I got up and walked over to the kitchen, my mind still wandering as I listened to the commotion going on in the next room. There was a loud scraping, like someone dragging a bed or dresser, and I could feel the vibrations rumbling through the floor. I sipped on my tea and looked around the kitchen, noting the lack of appliances and that there were only 2 chairs on the table. The scraping stopped suddenly. The bedroom door creaked open loudly, and I looked up from my cup, expecting to see someone coming down the hall. Instead, I heard a different door open and shut, followed by loud thumping, like someone jumping up and down. What the hell are they doing in there? Tyler laughed loudly as a series of shouts echoed from the flat screen and into the empty house. I glanced at him and then to the TV, when the light in the kitchen went out. A door slammed in the hall. The movie continued playing, and I could see the light on the microwave still blinking. "Cheap-ass bulbs," I groaned, and then went to turn the light off before switching the light bulb out. When I paused, the light switch was down. I glanced back at Tyler, then peered around the hall, the endless knocking and banging still going strong. "So what's the deal with this place?" I asked aloud as I flipped the switch and the light came back on. "What do you mean?" Tyler asked after a moment's distraction as he paused the movie. I sat down in the lumpy chair his dad had given him and gestured to the house as a whole with my hands. "Like, how did you get it? And from who?" "Oh, just some old man. Italian, I think. Mr. Scarpino or something like that." I waited for him to continue, but he just took a bite of pizza. "And? How'd you hear about it?" He shrugged. "Just saw a post online. Me and like 2 other guys came and looked at it. One of them got it. Then the old man called me like a week later saying it was available, and I moved in." I chewed my lip. "Why was it open again?" "The guy moved out. Just up and left." The wall behind me jolted violently and knocked over a bottle of whiskey Tyler had on display. It shattered and splashed across the floor, leaving the house suddenly silent. Tyler cursed loudly and jumped up to clean it. "All right, enough of this crap. I don't care if it's rude. This is nothing compared to what the douchebag in the other room is doing." I sighed and sat my tea down as Tyler threw a towel over the spilled liquor. "Hey man, seriously. What's up with your roommate?" Tyler looked up from the towel and laughed, his eyes staring up at the ceiling before meeting mine. "That's how I got the place so cheap." I tilted my head to the side, confused. "So what? He just pays a bigger share of rent?" He laughed again and sat down, looking around for the remote. The commotion in the room escalated suddenly to an all-time high, and I grew tense. My fingers dug into the armrest of my chair. The walls rattled and shook as if there were an earthquake, even the windows jostling flimsily. Tyler pressed play on the remote, the couch beneath him cracking as the impacts against the wall hit it. "No, man." He glanced at me out of the corner of his eye. "I don't have a roommate." The difference between 0 and 1. Mathematically, it's the same as the difference between 1 and 2, but from a philosophical point of view, it is much larger. A quitting smoker knows the difference. The willpower they wield when they've not smoked for half a day is small, but once that day is over, the willpower grows to the point where, if lucky, days turn to weeks and weeks turn to months. However, there is always that thought in the back of their head: "I can have just one. I'll start again tomorrow." But when they cave, the cycle starts over. They are no longer a non-smoker. They are a smoker who happened to not smoke for 3 months. That willpower is now back at 0, and they need to start again. Just 1 cigarette. It's the same with everything. What stops you from doing something bad? Is it the illegality of it? Is it the fact that you get caught? What stops you from turning those little thoughts everyone has into reality? It's willpower. The willpower it takes to resist your darkest thoughts, your morals. Those are the biggest hurdles. Do you let yourself think about how to get away with murder, letting your mind wander, conjuring up the perfect crime? What if you succeed? Came up with a foolproof scenario in your mind, picked a mark, you even reasoned with yourself why that person you picked deserves it. How much willpower do you need to turn your plan into reality? Considerably less. And if you succeed, how much willpower will you need for the next one? The difference between 1 and 2 is much smaller. Trust me. My neighbours were always strange people. They would leave at ungodly hours. They would blast out music every day at exactly 3:30 p.m. They would only let their dog out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Like I said, odd. I never really thought anything past that until I was about 10 years old. One day, my neighbours came knocking on my door. My parents answered it, and my mother proceeded to talk to the lady about some stupid stuff that doesn't really matter. I retreated to my room to avoid being sucked into the unbearable conversation, as it was obvious I was going to be. 15 minutes passed, and my mum finally came upstairs. She said the neighbours are going out of town for a week and that I needed to watch their dog. They said they'd pay me $20 for the whole week. Now, to a 10-year-old, that's a never say no type deal. Besides, I didn't have to sleep there, or even stay for a little while. It was right next door. All I figured I'd really have to do is let him out, pick up his poop, and feed him. Piece of cake. Then Saturday rolled around, the day my neighbours were leaving. I could hear them outside, sometime around 3 in the morning, slamming car doors and whatnot. They were talking, but I really couldn't hear what they said other than dog, safe, boy, and scummy. I only really made out one complete sentence. What if he notices? Of course, I didn't think anything of it at the time, so I awoke at a much more reasonable hour Sunday and decided to head over to the neighbours when it was around 2 p.m. When I stepped in, I could tell something was amiss. First off, there was this weird wallpaper covering every inch of the house. This wallpaper was black with these red splotches that looked like people scattered across it. There were very poorly drawn stars lining the top. The living room was odd too. It contained only a single couch and a small TV. Nothing else. The kitchen was the same level of emptiness, containing only 4 plates and 3 glasses. The weirdest thing though? There were pictures of the dog everywhere. I mean everywhere. The dog covered the fridge, the walls, everywhere. Not a single picture of either of the residents, however. I figured they must really love their dog. I noticed a note on the fridge. It read as follows. His name is Marcel. Feed him twice a day, once at 4 p.m. and once at 8 p.m. Be on time. Leave quickly and quietly after feeding him. Let him out on Tuesday and Thursday only, and only from 5 to 8 p.m. Do not go in the backyard. I should add that their backyard was completely fenced off. Couldn't even see over it if you're in the NSA. The food is in the fridge. I felt the note had strange points to it, but figured it was quite fitting for a family such as themselves. The thing that really got to me that first day is when I opened the fridge. It was empty, save for 4 containers, each labelled with a day of the week, 2 per day. They were all filled to the brim with this odd purple-red goo. I don't really know how to explain it past that, other than the fact that it smelled like milk about a month past its expiration date. I followed the directions, however, and both Sunday and Monday went by perfectly. The first difficulties came on Tuesday. After school, I decided to take a nap. I guess I slept through my alarm or didn't set one even. because I awoke at 4:45 p.m. I cursed myself for sleeping in and rushed to my neighbours. When I entered the house, I found Marcel sitting on the couch in the living room. The TV was on. Did I leave it on? He let out a loud snarl as I stepped inside. Something was odd about the dog. He seemed bigger than he was the day before, like significantly bigger. Cautiously, I walked past him and poured the goo into his bowl. He stomped over and let out another snarl before fiercely lapping up the stuff. I opened the sliding glass door in the back to let him out, seeing as it was about 5. This is where I really got frightened. The backyard was covered in a thick blanket of fog, which was especially odd seeing as it was most definitely not foggy when I walked over here. When I slammed the door shut, I swear I heard a shriek come from somewhere in the fog. When I let Marcel in at 8, everything seemed normal, and everything would remain that way until Saturday rolled around. You see, I was spending Friday night at my friend's house. I decided, seeing as I would be there at 6, missing my 8 o'clock feeding time, I would just feed the dog both containers at 4, and he'd be fine. So, when I returned Saturday afternoon, I did not expect what I found. Marcel was again sitting in the couch. This time, the TV showed nothing but static. He looked sick, and he barely raised his head to look at me as I walked in. For some odd reason, the dog looked frail, smaller, and more bony than I remembered him. I tried to pet him, but he snapped at me, so I decided to try to feed him. He whimpered as I poured the goo, but reluctantly lapped it up. Although, when I tried this again at 8, he refused. I knew the neighbours would come home the next day, and I didn't want to leave any trace of my failure, so I poured the goo down the drain. Suddenly, Marcel began to howl. A blood-curdling howl that happens when a dog is in great pain. Then, from the backyard, came a bone-chilling shriek, one that haunts me and remains unexplained to this day. The goo began to bubble from the sink, and was now a deep purple. I rushed home, and didn't tell my folks any of this. Sunday rolled around and I figured that the neighbours would be storming over to tell my folks. However, they never came. They just blasted music all day and shut it off promptly at 6 p.m. I could hear a very low, almost inaudible moan periodically come from the backyard all day. When I woke up Monday morning, there was a moving truck outside the neighbour's house. I never learned what became of Marcel or the neighbours, but the house stood empty for years. I snuck into it once to peer into the backyard. There was no more fog, but everything was dead. The grass, the plants, everything. There were also these huge gashes made in the earth. No idea where they came from, but they were much too large to be made by a dog. I mean, these gashes were as wide as my 10-year-old self. I couldn't begin to tell you what was happening in that house, but I don't think I'll ever want to know. I've been in this damn room for days, waiting for my mom to tell me to come out. Thank God she forgot to take my laptop away, or I would be going absolutely insane right now. The cow is always trying her hardest to make my life hell. Sometimes I wonder if that's the only reason I was born. This argument was pretty bad though. I almost regret hitting her. The argument happened a few days ago. I had just gotten home from school and she was already waiting for me in the living room, Sitting on the table in front of her was a bag of weed I had bought the day before. She didn't even have to say a word. "What the hell is this?" Obviously, she knew what she was looking at. There was no point giving an answer to a stupid question, so I just walked into the kitchen. "I'm talking to you." "Well, I'm ignoring you," I replied with a smart-ass smile on my face. Not the smartest move. She grabbed me by the arm and pulled me into the living room. The look on her face actually almost scared me. Almost. "This is bullcrap. I'm tired of you walking around like I owe you something. First you start getting into fights and disobeying teachers, and now you're on drugs, blah 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 blah. You get the picture." I sat there for what felt like hours listening to her rant. That's when the voice I'd been hearing so often started to interrupt her. "Shut her up," I heard inside my head. I couldn't do that though. This was my mother, and I knew it wouldn't be the same as fighting some punk kid at school. Sometimes I would lose control, but I would never do it to my own mom. "Are you even listening to me?" I nodded to her and looked at her with a fake expression of remorse. Maybe if I pretended like she was getting through to me, she would shut up. She saw through it though and got even angrier. Now she went on about how desensitized I was and how I needed a therapist. My father couldn't even stand being around me before he was sent overseas, etc. "Shut her up!" The voice echoed in my head louder now, repeating itself over and over. I stood up and hit her. I blacked out after that and came to in my room. I heard her yell at me through the door not to leave the room until she says I can. It wasn't the time to disobey her. I couldn't believe she didn't call the cops on me. I sat in that room all day. Hunger crept up on me, but when I yelled if I could come out to eat, she didn't reply. She was obviously ignoring me, so I just decided to sneak out my window and grab some food from the McDonald's down the street. Days have passed now, and I'm still in this room. She hasn't checked on me. I peeked out of my room once to see if she was there, and she was sitting on the couch, exactly where she was when I had hit her. "Can I come out now?" I asked. She didn't respond. Didn't move. I walked out of the room and made my way over to her. The side of her head was a bloody mess, and the lamp was lying next to her on the couch. I didn't know I had hit her that hard. Quietly, I snuck back into my room and sat on my bed. Another day has passed in this room. I know she's out there on the couch, but I know she's okay. I'd heard her tell me to stay in this room, and I will until she lets me out. Hopefully it's soon though, because the living room is really starting to smell bad. The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, we naturally try and seek these things out. Doing so has led to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we never could have imagined 100 years ago. We have defeated diseases, built to the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us and what we have created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge has not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge. And, in the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I do not say this from the standpoint of a great philosopher who has sat and simply pondered things either. No, I say this because I have seen it, experienced it. I was a part of it. The event I am about to relate to you is true in its entirety. This, I swear. I feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, as many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills. But I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is to simply warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain it will happen again. In 1971, a not so well known scientist began preparations for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger experiment. I would like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this recounting, I will refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear at best beyond 1971. All that is known about him before that time is that he had grown up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination of the occult and supernatural. This later made him an outcast among his fellow scientists due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was, and still is at the time. Zimmerman's opinions concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause of him being an outcast, though. It was his methods that made him widely unaccepted among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during his time for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He never cared about the means. All that mattered to him was results, and if he predicted the results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was this insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him, and the few that knew of him and did not fear him believed in him and followed him and his work very closely. The word harbinger itself has such a mystery and intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls off our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project. But the word always seems to carry a certain amount of doom with it, which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reason for giving the experiment this title, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to a select few, me being one of them. He told us he was working on something big, and that he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he did not fully trust some of us, he did know that we were professionals and that for some reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but I was caught stealing medication and was promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume, so work was hard to find. I was also a native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while, some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It is still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment. I would not be wholly surprised if his financing was not entirely legal. But legal or not, I needed the money, and he was paying. Looking back, it's a decision I have come to regret. After Zimmerman obtained his money, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, and upon that piece of land, Zimmerman built a concrete structure, not dissimilar to a bunker in fact. The sole difference being that its goal was to keep any potential damage contained within the structure, rather than keeping it out, as he put it. Most of the structure dug underneath the earth, which had the effect of making the underground complex seem so much smaller than it really was from the outside, as would be expected. There was only one way of entering and leaving the underground structure, and it was via a ladder that led from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I will refer to from now on as the entrance building for convenience, to the network below. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a very large and thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff Zimmerman had hired. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room. This is where the facility's electronics and such were linked to. This included security cameras, lights, and door controls. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of this large, central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One that led to a smaller room that served as the infirmary, another led to a break room, and the last door led into the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel extremely eerie. They were, for some reason, laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the complex, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with the complex. But if you knew where you were going, you would find yourself standing before one of 3 8-by-8-foot rooms before long. Each room had a camera hugged up to one of the corners of the room, and all 3 of those cameras were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to, when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of the 3 8-by-8-foot rooms, and in order to open them, you would have to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived at the complex, how badly the hallways frightened me. I have always been claustrophobic, you see, and those hallways were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately, the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me in those bleak, narrow hallways. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel you were trapped down there. Thankfully though, I only rarely ventured into those hallways, for I was the only medical professional in the facility and I had virtually no reason to go into them. In the beginning, I found it so peculiar that Zimmerman would ask for a medical professional like me on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on the reports being sent out, at least. But unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the project, excluding the subjects, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, Zimmerman had always had an obsession with the occult and supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who did not believe in him. He wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to attain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find proof of the metaphysical, a world we could not see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting and even scary, but it was Zimmerman's method of doing so that was truly terrifying. Zimmerman believed that he would be able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over to our world, and each one of these beings would be trapped within one of the 3 rooms. Zimmerman had the theory that any entity would try and latch onto the nearest living thing that had the capacity for it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with the compound mixture of Zimmerman's creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way that it would be able to leave a host who had been injected with the compound was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession. And there is only one known species that possesses the amount of will required for this: humans. Zimmerman had also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and there would only be one entity in each room, though I cannot say I know what exactly he did. In fact, I know next to nothing when it comes to how Zimmerman managed to do what he did. He liked to keep his methodology a secret to most of his trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and take credit for the success of said ideas. If I had known that this was the true purpose before I signed up, I may have reconsidered. But Zimmerman decided not to tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been allowed to do so. The security team Zimmerman had hired was loyal to him, and the payout? It is not likely that Zimmerman had given them the order to not allow anyone to leave. There were 3 different subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless study on the effect of isolation on the human mind, as I mentioned before. Which is why none of the subjects objected when they realized that they would be confined to one of the 3 rooms that I had mentioned earlier. The first subject was a young man. He was apparently out of work and desperately needed the money that had been offered for participating in the study. The second was a woman. By looking at her, I could tell she was an addict of some sort. The third and final subject was an older man. A drifter, if I had to guess. One thing that they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them, which is why they were chosen for the project. I'm sorry, I wish I could supply more information about the subjects, but all of this has been drawn from memory and I was given little information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment did not officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin, so I packed up and headed out to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived at the compound a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a whole month before the project even began. I was not the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman and his colleagues and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among the people Zimmerman did not trust to arrive first. Everyone had arrived about a week before the experiment began. There was a noticeable rift between those who were there simply for the money, like me, and those who were followers of Zimmerman. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms. The cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and all the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. Zimmerman asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all his theories had been correct and that he was not just a madman. He wanted us all to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned back to us, leaned into the microphone that would project his voice through the 3 rooms, and then he began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but Zimmerman could understand. We all observed the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their room, dumbstruck by Zimmerman's chanting, staring at the monitors with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I cannot explain what exactly it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake, subtly, and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong while the subjects began dashing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then, suddenly, the ground stopped shaking and the monitor's image turned to static. The air began to become very heavy as we all stared at the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us what was happening or had happened in those 3 rooms. For a while, all was silent, but then there was screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain and terror began to echo through the compound. The similar screams of men began to coincide with the woman's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were here for the money began to give each other scared looks, while those loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew deep down that Zimmerman would never allow it to happen. We were here for the long haul, and there was no escape. It was 10:13 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped. The monitors had yet to reveal to us what had occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screaming ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us all for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Not like any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins and settled in for the night. I feel it is safe to say that not all of us slept well that night, and I was not one of them. The following morning, all of the staff had arrived at the entrance building. We all stood inside and exchanged tired or nervous looks as we waited for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others did not seem to have been even remotely affected by what happened last night. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness as he came through the door of the entrance building. He opened the hatch and, without any hesitation, began descending the ladder downwards into the black abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow behind Zimmerman's dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the farther I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. And, as I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that this place was different somehow. While before there was only the unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else. Something made the eeriness feel so real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there. But I continued climbing downward, despite my fear and my hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was a darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now lived here, and I could feel it. We all could. I finally felt my foot touch the ground and let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcoming light. Zimmerman must have turned the power on, I thought. I allowed myself to take a couple seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it last night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way towards the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by monitor 1 and 3, which was still pure static, and would have been a small relief. But then the motionless image on monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed entirely untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was frozen into a gaunt face as she lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images on monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The security team nodded at hearing this. They made it seem as if they had no fear, but I could see it in their eyes. The subtle, loud tick-tock of the clock was the only sound that echoed through the control room while I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 had gone by. The static was still all that occupied monitor 1 and 3. All of the other staff members were working except me. This was due to the fact that the project had been completely injury-free thus far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for someone to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues and I were the only ones that occupied the room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side of the room while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I had clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of this, and God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as monitor 3's image returned. The clear image now displayed on screen made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid thing stood in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued, but this clearly was not the same man that had entered the room. What caught my attention first was its eyes. They were solid black, and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed so endless, and so cold. Its head had also grown with its eyes in such a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being had also shed all of the hair it once had, and even from the monitor, I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen in the fact that the jumpsuit was now obviously far too small for its wearer. Its limbs had grown especially long. Its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man we had sent inside. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare into the monitor at the thing in the room, and my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which made me feel kind of good. It may sound awful, but It was a bit satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could feel fear too. But at the same time, it was worrying because this showed that this was not part of Zimmerman's plan. Something had gone wrong. We all stared into the monitor at the thing despite our fear. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in its terrifying, hypnotic gaze. After what felt like forever, I managed to break eye contact with the creature and divert my attention from the monitor. And when I did so, I felt my fear levels drop considerably. After a short while, Zimmerman ordered his security team to make their way to Subject 1's door, just as he said he would do. The Subject team left without question, armed only with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men's progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room via the cameras. Even through the not-so-high quality cameras, it wasn't hard to tell that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They did not possess the same confidence within them that they did when this project began. They looked like scared boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had perfect vision of them and the door via the hallway camera. One of them said something through one of their walkie-talkies and made a motion towards the camera. In response, one of Zimmerman's colleagues buzzed open the door. The men already had their pistols out by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door began to open. We all watched eagerly as the men began to approach the door, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a loud shriek. And as something bounded out of the room at the men, the monitor turned into static. Immediately, we could hear screaming, echoing down the hallways, followed shortly after by the distant sound of gunshots. We could do nothing but wait. After a couple minutes, the screaming and gunshots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever bounded at them from the room would not be the one to return to the control room. After a couple more minutes, 3 of the men came back, carrying with them the corpse of the 4th. He had a massive cut covering his chest, and his face was shredded. You couldn't even tell who he was anymore, or even that he was human. I was used to gore, being a doctor and all, and I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and blooded meat they carried with them, but many of the others went pale and vomited. The security team all wore emotionless expressions and eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us. He stared at us for a while with those wide eyes of his. "It's dead," he finally managed to mutter in a shaken and scared voice. A couple hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank. He was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were unharmed, physically at least. The 3rd was alive, but only barely. His body was covered in bloody slashes and one of his eyes had been gouged out. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men vaguely explained what happened. Apparently, Subject 1 leaped out at Frank after the door had opened. Only, it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, it had a hideously contorted face and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over a dozen times before it fell dead, and then they emptied another dozen bullets into it just to be sure it was really dead. Only once it was dead did they come back. After tending to the wounded man, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what those monitors may have held, I needed to see. Subject 3 was the only one left now, and I needed to see it and make sure the creature was still in its room. It seemed to be more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point, though, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room and the hallway outside it displayed a static-filled screen. No one was sent to repair them or investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly the same as I had left it. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera at us. He was